The new zookeeper smiled, that patient, condescending smile reserved for the elderly. "Ma'am, please don't baby talk the animals," he said, loud enough for the small crowd to laugh at me. He thought I was just a confused old woman, but he had no idea I was just saying hello to the 400-pound silverback I had raised from birth. The air smelled the same. That was the first thing I noticed. It was a complex mix: damp earth, fresh-cut hay, the metallic temps of the perimeter fences, and underneath it all, the sweet, musty scent of the great apes. It was the smell of my life's work. And I hadn't breathed it in for 2 years. Not since my retirement party, anyway, where they'd given me a heavy plaque and a lifetime pass I'd left in a drawer. It felt strange to walk these paths as a guest. I had traded my functional khaki uniform for comfortable jeans and a simple blue sweater. It felt like a costume. I saw new signage, a new cafe, and new younger staff in uniforms that looked greener and stiffer than mine ever were. I bypassed the giraffes and the reptile house, though I loved them both. My feet knew the way. I was heading to the West African sector. My sector. I rounded the corner by the big fiberglass baobab tree, and there it was, the great ape habitat. I stopped for a moment, just looking. I'd sketched this habitat on a greasy diner napkin 25 years ago. I'd fought the board, the budget, and the construction crews to make sure the sightlines were right, that the climbing structures were made of real, cured timber, not concrete. I'd insisted on the heated rocks for the cold mornings and the hidden misters for the hot afternoons. It was, I'd always felt, a good place. The crowd was thick today, 3DIP against the massive viewing glass. A young man in one of those crisp green uniforms was speaking through a small headset microphone. He was loud, full of a performer's energy, gesturing wildly. "And the big guy over there, that's Kale," the zookeeper announced. His name tag? I saw, "Reed Ben." He weighs over 400 pounds of pure muscle. An incredible specimen. I filtered out his voice. My eyes were only on Kale. He was in the back, near the waterfall I'd designed to muffle the sounds of the service road. He wasn't enjoying the crowd. He was pacing. A short, tight loop from the rock wall to the moat's edge. His shoulders were tense. He swiped an irritated hand at a piece of straw, tossing it. They were subtle signs, but I could read them like a book. He was stressed. The noise level was too high. Zookeeper Ben was encouraging the crowd to clap and cheer, which was a bad idea. A very bad idea. I moved quietly through the crowd, finding a small gap near the edge of the viewing glass, away from the worst of the noise. I was just a few yards from Kale, though the thick laminated glass was between us. He looked magnificent, a true silverback, powerful and dominant. But I didn't see the 400-pound specimen. I saw the tiny 3-pound infant I had held in my arms. His mother had rejected him, and I was the one who sat with him through the long nights, rubbing his small, bony back until he finally slept. I remembered the specific, milky smell of his formula and the tight, leathery grip of his tiny hand around my finger. I watched him pace. He stopped and looked toward the crowd, his brow low. I kept my body still, my hands at my sides. Softly, from the back of my throat, I made the sound. It was a low, rolling HRRMPH grunt. It wasn't baby talk. It was a contact call, a question. "I am here. Are you well?" Kale stopped pacing instantly. His massive head turned just slightly. His ear twitched. He looked toward the glass, not at me, but toward the sound. His brow furrowed. He seemed to be listening for a ghost. "Ma'am." The voice was sharp, amplified by the microphone. I turned. Zookeeper Ben was striding toward me, a practiced, patient smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. He lowered his microphone, but his voice was still loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. He was making an example of me. "Ma'am, please don't baby talk the animals," he said. He tapped his own temple, as if suggesting I was confused. My cheeks grew warm. I wasn't. It really agitates them. he continued, cutting me off. "And honestly, they can't understand you. We're the professionals here. We have specific training for interaction." He winked at a group of teenagers who were now looking at me, some of them smiling. "We wouldn't want to upset Cale, would we?" I looked at this young man, at his pressed uniform and his bright white sneakers. He couldn't have been more than 20. "I wasn't agitating him," I said simply. My voice was quiet. Ben scoffed, a small puff of air. "Right. Well, just let us handle the animals, okay? Enjoy your visit." He dismissed me with a little patting gesture in the air and turned back to his audience, raising his microphone. "Now, as I was saying, the Silverback's diet is primarily vegetarian. I turned back to the glass. Cale was still watching the spot where I stood. He looked confused. I put my hand up, almost to touch the glass, but I stopped myself. I wasn't staff anymore. I wasn't Dr. Thorne, head primatologist. I was just an old woman in a blue sweater, being told to behave. I stayed there, watching the gorilla I had raised, while the young man explained things about him that he had only ever read in a book. I tried to blend into the concrete wall. I was embarrassed and a little angry. I watched Ben preen for the crowd, his confidence restored after putting me in my place. "Now, a lot of people think gorillas are just big, dumb animals," Ben was saying, his voice booming from the speakers again. "But they are actually incredibly smart. We use enrichment exercises to keep their minds active. Cale, here, is one of our smartest." He was trying to get Cale to interact, but Cale was ignoring him. The gorilla had his back to the crowd, pulling at a clump of grass. Ben's demonstration was failing. He was losing his audience. The teenagers who had laughed at me were now looking at their phones. Ben's smile tightened. He needed to get the show back. "Hey, Cale!" he shouted, walking right up to the glass. "Big guy! Look over here!" Cale didn't move. The crowd pressed in, sensing the zookeeper's frustration. "Sometimes he's a little shy," Ben said, and I heard the edge in his voice. He let out another one of those false, bright laughs. Then he did it. He balled his hand into a fist and rapped his knuckles on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. A cold jolt went straight through my chest. No, it was the first rule. The one you learn before you even get a set of keys. You don't startle them. You don't challenge them. And you never hit the glass? Cale's head snapped around. The casual grass-pulling stopped. He rose from his crouch, and the air around him seemed to change. His hair, the dark fur on his shoulders and arms, stood on end, making him look twice as large. A deep, coughing bark-huff shot from his chest. It was a clear warning. "Stop! I should have stepped in." I should have said, "Son, back away from the glass now." But I was a guest. I was just an old woman who had been told to be quiet. Ben didn't see the warning. He saw a reaction. He saw his show. "Whoa, see?" he said to the crowd, pointing. "He's getting a little feisty. He knows who's boss." He tapped the glass again, harder this time. "Come on, Cale, show 'em. Show 'em the big man." That was the last straw. Cale didn't roar. He didn't beat his chest. He just moved. It was terrifyingly fast. One moment, he was 30 feet away by the rocks. The next, he was at the glass. The sound was not a sound. It was an explosion. A boom that hit me in the chest so hard it took my breath away. I felt the vibration through the soles of my shoes. The entire 3-inch thick panel of safety glass bowed, shuddering in its frame. Cale slammed both fists into it at once. The screaming started. It was instant. A single high-pitched wave of pure panic. People fell backward, stumbling over each other. A man dropped his camera and it shattered on the concrete. A child, separated from his mother, was wailing. "He's breaking it," someone shrieked. "He's going to get out." I looked at Ben. His face was white. All the color had drained from it. His professional smile was gone, replaced by the slack-jawed, wide-eyed look of pure terror. He was just a kid. A terrified kid who had lost control. He fumbled at his belt, his hand shaking so badly he couldn't unclip his radio. Code red, code red. He finally shouted, his voice cracking, breaking into a high-pitched squeak. He's agitated. He's breached. No, he's just back up. Everyone, back up! He was waving his arms wildly, but the crowd was already a stampede, a mess of running bodies. I hadn't moved. My feet felt glued to the spot. Cale was right there, inches from my face. His own face was pressed to the glass. His nostrils flared. His teeth were bared, and a deep, rattling roar finally tore out of him. The sound was so loud it felt like it was inside my head. He raised his fists and slammed the glass again. Boom! Then again. BOOM. The world was pure chaos. People shouting, alarms faintly ringing in the distance, Ben screaming into his radio, and Cale, a 400-pound force of pure rage trying to get through. I just stood there. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't from fear. It was from a deep, profound sadness. He was terrified. I knew this behavior. This wasn't aggression. This was panic. He was trapped, and the young man in charge was making it worse. Ben was useless. He was pressed against the back wall, still shouting nonsense into his radio. The crowd was gone, just a few scattered strollers and dropped bags left behind. The alarms were blaring, a shrill, pulsing beep-beep-beep that did nothing but add to the panic. In Cale. He was still screaming, a deep, hoarse sound of fury and fear. He pounded the glass one more time, a final, frustrated thud. He reared back, tensing his massive shoulders. He was getting ready to charge again, to throw his full weight against the barrier. But in that moment, in the lull between the impact and the next charge, his eyes scanned the empty viewing area. The running, screaming people were gone. He saw only me. He froze, his chest was heaving. Saliva dripped from his bared teeth, but his eyes, his dark, intelligent eyes, locked onto mine. The rage was still there, a fire burning deep inside, but now there was something else. Confusion. He didn't understand. Why was I still there? Why wasn't I screaming? Why wasn't I running? I didn't think. I just acted. Decades of training took over. I blocked out the sound of the alarms. I blocked out Ben's voice, which had turned into a high-pitched, "Oh God, oh God." In my world, there were only two living things. Me and the terrified animal in front of me. I looked Cale directly in the eye. I held his gaze. I let him see that my hands were empty, that my posture was low and unthreatening then. Very slowly, I raised my right hand. I didn't wave. I didn't point. I held it up, palm open, fingers relaxed. Cale's eyes darted to my hand. He let out a short, sharp huff. "What are you doing?" I held his gaze. Slowly, I closed my hand into a soft, loose fist. Then, just as slowly, I opened it again. It was a simple movement. Palm, fist, palm. It was the calm signal. I hadn't done it in 20 years. Not since he was a small, gangly infant who would wake up screaming from nightmares. I would sit with him in the dark nursery, the smell of warm milk in the air, and I would make that sign. I am here. The threat is gone. You are safe. Calm Cale stopped. His entire 400-pound body went still. He stared at my hand. His breathing was heavy, a ragged huh. That fogged the glass. I did it again. Palm, fist, palm. The fire in his eyes didn't just go out. It was like a tap had been turned off. The rage vanished. The bared teeth grimace softened. His lips came together. He let out a low, rumbling sound. A hum grunt. It was a sound of deep confusion. It was the sound of a memory surfacing from a long, long time ago. He looked from my hand to my face, and back to my hand. He dropped from his full, intimidating height down to all fours. The tension in his shoulders disappeared. He took a single, heavy step back from the glass. Then, with a sigh so deep I felt it more than heard it, Cale slowly sat down. He didn't look at me anymore. He did something far more important. He turned his broad silver-flecked back to me, presenting his shoulder. It was the ultimate sign of trust. I am calm. I am no longer a threat. I trust you not to harm me. The enclosure was suddenly, shockingly silent. The beep, beep, beep of the alarms seemed very far away. The only sound was my own heart hammering against my ribs. I hadn't realized I was holding my breath. I let it out slowly. "Who are you?" The voice was a hoarse whisper. It was Ben. He had finally dropped his radio. It dangled from its cord, bumping softly against his leg. His face was slick with sweat. He wasn't looking at the gorilla. He was staring at me. The silence in the viewing area was heavy. It was broken only by the beep, beep, beep of the alarm system and the sound of Ben's ragged breathing. He had slid down the wall and was sitting on the concrete path. His radio forgotten, Cale was calm. He was methodically picking bits of straw from his leg, his back still turned to us, a clear sign of peace. He had already moved on. Ben had not. He looked at me, his eyes wide and unfocused. "What did you do?" he whispered. I asked. "Who are you?" I didn't owe him an explanation. I didn't owe him anything. I kept my eyes on Cale, making sure his breathing remained even, that his shoulders stayed relaxed. He was fine. "Ben," a new voice cut through the air. It was sharp, official, and full of panic. I turned. 2 men in suits were running down the path, followed by several other zookeepers in their green uniforms. The man in the lead was the zoo director. I recognized him from the photos in the staff newsletter. He had taken over the year after I left. He skidded to a stop, his eyes taking in the scene. He saw the terrified, scattered items from the crowd. He saw Ben, pale and shaken on the ground. He saw Cale sitting peacefully, and then he saw me. His face cycled through 3 emotions in just a few seconds. Confusion, then annoyance, and finally a slow, dawning recognition. "Double quotes, Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice hesitant. Ben's head snapped up. He looked from the director to me, his mouth half open. "What happened here?" the director demanded, his authority returning. He pointed a shaking finger at Ben. "We got a code red. A habitat breach? What did you do?" "It wasn't me, sir," Ben stammered, scrambling to his feet. He was brushing dirt off his clean uniform. "It was the gorilla. He went crazy. He was trying to break the glass. I told everyone to back up. I followed procedure." The director looked at Cale, who was now lying down, arranging his straw bedding for a nap. He looked back at Ben, his expression hardening. "He doesn't look crazy, Ben. He looks like he's ready to sleep. The glass is intact. You, however, look like you've seen a ghost." "But he was," Ben insisted, his voice getting desperate. He was pounding on it. "Sir, I swear. And. And then he pointed at me. She was baby-talking to him. I told her to stop, and then he charged. And then she did this thing with her hand, and he just ... stopped." The director was silent. He stared at me for a long, long moment. The alarms were still ringing, but no one seemed to notice them anymore. "Ben," the director said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Shut off your radio. The alarm is feedbacking." Ben fumbled with the radio, finally clicking it off. The beep, beep, beep stopped. The silence that fell was absolute. "Ben," the director said again, stepping closer to him. "Do you have any idea who this is?" Ben just shook his head, looking at me like I was some kind of magician. "This," the director said, gesturing to me, "is Dr. Eris Thorne." The name didn't mean anything to Ben. I could see it in his blank expression. He was just a kid. To him, history started the day he was hired. The director saw his confusion and his patience finally snapped. She is the woman who built this place, son. She designed this entire habitat. She ran the primatology department for 30 years. He took another step, lowering his voice. And that gorilla? He pointed at Kale, who was now dozing. She raised him. From birth? She was more of a mother to him than his own. I watched the blood drain from Ben's face. He had been white from fear. Now he was a pale, sickly gray. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked from the director to me, and then to the 400-pound gorilla sleeping peacefully just feet away. The dots connected. The baby talk, the hand thing, his arrogance, his confidence, his professional authority, it all just crumbled. It fell away, leaving a very young, very small, and very embarrassed boy behind. I didn't know, he whispered. No, the director said, his voice like ice. You didn't. I watched Ben's face. He looked like he'd been slapped. His eyes darted between me and the director, as if he was hoping one of us would tell him it was a complicated joke. But there was no joke. There was only the quiet, sleeping form of the gorilla he had almost sent into a destructive rampage. Sir, he began, his voice barely a rasp. He looked at me, and his face, which had been so full of smug confidence just minutes before, was now a mask of pure, sickening humiliation. Ma'am, Dr. Thorne, I am so sorry. I didn't know. They ... They just showed us videos in training. They never mentioned that the animals are individuals. The director cut in, his tone sharp. That they have memories? That they have relationships? Or did you just skip that day to practice your speech? No, sir. Ben's words failed him. He was a child again, caught doing something terribly wrong. Go to my office, the director commanded, his voice low and final. Now, hand your radio and your keys to Mark. He gestured to one of the other zookeepers who had been standing back watching the whole thing. Ben didn't protest. He just nodded, his shoulders slumped. He unclipped his radio and his large ring of keys and handed them over. He looked small, stripped of his authority. He looked like a boy in a costume that was suddenly too big for him. He had to walk past me to get to the exit path. He stopped, just for a second. He couldn't quite meet my eyes. He looked at the concrete at my feet. Dr. Thorne, he mumbled. I really am sorry. I looked at him. I wasn't angry. The warmth that had flooded my cheeks during his condescending little speech was long gone. I felt a deep, weary sadness. I saw the 22-year-old kid who thought a uniform and a microphone made him an expert. I saw the arrogance that came from reading a manual, but never really seeing the animal in front of him. He hadn't been malicious. He had just been ignorant. And that, in our line of work, was far more dangerous. You were right about one thing. Ben, I said quietly. He looked up, surprised that I had spoken. He is smart, I said, nodding toward Kale, who let out a soft, sleepy sigh in his straw. He's smarter than you know. He's listening, always. I paused, letting the silence sit for a moment. He wasn't baby-talking, young man. He was communicating. I let my eyes meet his. You should try it sometime. Listening, I mean. He flinched, as if my quiet words were a physical blow. He didn't have an answer for that. He just gave a single, jerky nod. Then he turned and walked away. He walked quickly, his head down, not looking back. The other keepers, after a nod from the director, followed him. Leaving the two of us alone in the viewing area, the director sighed, running a hand through his hair. Dr. Thorne, Eris, on behalf of the zoo, I apologize. I don't know what to say. We're cutting back on training hours, and that's the result. It's not an excuse. He was just a boy, I said, my voice tired. I turned away from him, back to the glass, back to Kale. He's beautiful, isn't he? I said, my voice softening. The director came to stand beside me. We stood there for a long time, just two primatologists looking at a gorilla. The way the exhibit was always intended to be viewed, quietly, respectfully. "He's magnificent," the director agreed. "A credit to you. To your design." "No," I said. I put my hand up, my palm resting flat against the cool, thick glass. It was a barrier, but it was also a connection. He's a credit to himself. Cale must have felt the vibration, or maybe he just sensed me. In his sleep, he rolled over. He settled his massive back right against the glass, as close to my hand as he could possibly get. He let out another deep, rumbling sigh, a sound of perfect contentment. It was an old habit. It was something he used to do when he was small, sleeping in his nursery, and I was sitting in the chair next to him, finishing my reports for the night. He would always make sure some part of him was touching me. It seemed that after 20 years, some things hadn't changed at all. "Well," the director said, letting out a long breath. He rubbed the back of his neck. "That's enough excitement for one day. The response team will stand down once they see Cale is just fine. Can I buy you a coffee, Dr. Thorne? In my office. It's the least I can do." I looked at Cale one last time. He was sound asleep, his big chest rising and falling in a slow, easy rhythm. The crisis was over. He was safe. "I'd like that," I said. "Thank you." We walked away from the enclosure. The path was still littered with the debris of the Panica single pink sneaker. A spilled popcorn box. A child's sippy cup. A cleanup crew was already starting to sweep, their movements quiet, respectful. The zoo was slowly coming back to life. The distant calls of the birds and the bark of the sea lions started to filter in again, replacing the terrible sound of the alarms. A few visitors who had hidden behind the pretzel stand were peering out, their faces pale. "I am truly sorry you had to see that," the director said as we walked. We were on a staff-only path now, a narrow asphalt lane between the back of the flamingo pond and the supply warehouse. The air smelled of chlorine and hibiscus. "He's a new hire," the director continued, "more to himself than to me. He's one of 3 we brought on this spring. They're all so ... eager." He said the word like it was a diagnosis. "They come straight out of their university programs. They have all the textbook answers. They know the biology, the dietary needs, the enrichment schedules." He shook his head. "But they don't have the patience. They think respect is something they get with the uniform." I nodded, my hands tucked into the pockets of my jeans. He wanted a show. He thought Cale was a performer. "Exactly," the director said, frustrated. He was playing to the crowd. He wasn't watching the animal. He missed every sign. The pacing, the posture. Cale was telling him to back off for a full 5 minutes before he charged. "You saw it, didn't you?" "I did," I said. "Of course you did." He kicked a small pebble off the path. "He'll be on desk duty for a month. We'll have him redo his entire animal handling certification. If he stays, that is. Most of them don't, after something like this. Their pride is too wounded." I thought about Ben's face, that mixture of terror and shame. "Maybe his pride needs to be wounded," I said softly. "Maybe that's the only way he'll learn that he is not the most important being in that enclosure." The director looked at me, a small, appreciative smile on his face. "That's what my old mentor used to say. You're the last of that generation, Eris, the ones who listened." We reached the admin building, a low brick structure hidden behind a stand of bamboo. It was quiet inside. The air conditioning was a soft hum, and the air smelled of floor wax and coffee. It was a world away from the rich, earthy smells of the habitats. His office was neat. A large desk, a bookshelf, and a big window that looked out onto a small, tidy courtyard. He gestured to a chair and went to a small machine in the corner. "Black, 2 sugars, if I remember right," he asked. I was startled. "Yes, I'm surprised you remember that. I was your intern for a summer 25 years ago," he said, handing me a steaming mug. "You probably don't remember me. I was the terrified kid you sent to clean the Colobus monkey quarantine. I looked at him, really looked at him. The graying hair, the lines around his eyes. And then I saw him. The nervous, lanky college student who had dropped an entire bag of primate chow. David, I said. David Chen. I remember. You were a good listener, even then. He smiled, a genuine one this time. I had a good teacher. We still talk about the Thorn method in our training. You know? Ben probably thought it was just a name in a book. I don't think he ever realized he'd meet the author. I took a sip of the coffee. It was hot and strong, and it felt good in my hands. It wasn't a method, David. It was just ... Paying attention? It was time. Decades of time. He sat down across from me, his own mug cupped in his hands. Well, that's what's missing. They want to be experts in 6 weeks. They want the title. They don't want to do the work. We sat in silence for a minute. It was comfortable. It was the shared quiet of two people who understood deeply what had almost gone wrong today, and why. You know, he said, setting his mug down. We're struggling. We need trainers for the new staff. People who can teach them what you know. What Ben clearly doesn't. He leaned forward, his expression serious. Would you? Would you ever consider coming back, Eris? Not as staff, but as a consultant? A guest lecturer? Just to talk to them? To show them? The question hung in the air. Me, come back. I had been so sure I was finished, that my time here was over. I had accepted the plaque and the lifetime pass, and I had closed that door. But today, ... Today, when Cale's eyes met mine, a part of me I thought was long retired had woken up. I looked out the window, past the tidy courtyard, toward the faint, familiar sounds of the zoo, toward the place where Cale was sleeping. I held the warm mug in my hands, feeling the heat sink into my palms. I thought about my small garden. I thought about the stack of books on my nightstand I'd been meaning to read. I thought about the quiet, predictable rhythm of my retired life. It was a good life. It was peaceful, but it wasn't this. It wasn't the jolt in my chest when Cale's eyes met mine. It wasn't the deep, grounding certainty that I knew what to do when everyone else was panicking. It wasn't the feeling of his presence, even through 3 inches of glass. As he settled at my command, that was a part of me I had packed away with my old uniforms. I hadn't realized how much I missed it. I'm not sure I want to be a lecturer, David, I said slowly, placing the mug on his desk. I'm done with boardrooms and budgets. I don't want an office. His face started to fall, but I held up a hand. But I could, I continued, be convinced to spend a few hours a week on the habitat paths. With your new keepers? With Ben, if he's willing. A wide, relieved smile spread across David's face. Eris, I would call that whatever you want. On-site mentorship, senior advisor, you name it. I don't need a title, I said. I stood up. I just need the new hires to understand that this job, it isn't about being in charge. It's about being accepted. Thank you, Eris, he said, standing as well. Truly, shall I have someone walk you to the gate? No, I said, buttoning my sweater. I know the way. We said our goodbyes, and I left the quiet of the admin building. I walked back out onto the main path. The zoo was almost empty now. It was late afternoon, the golden hour, and the park would be closing soon. The air was cooling, and the sounds of the animals were changing. Settling in for the night, I didn't go toward the exit. My feet took me back one last time. To the West African sector, I rounded the corner by the fiberglass baobab tree. The viewing area was completely empty. The spilled popcorn was gone, the dropped sneaker retrieved. It was just me. He was awake. Cale was sitting near the front of the habitat, not far from the glass. He was slowly chewing on a piece of sugar cane, one of his favorite treats. He looked completely at peace, the afternoon sun catching the silver hairs on his back. He must have heard my footsteps on the concrete. His chewing slowed. He turned his head. He saw me. I stopped, standing in the same spot where Ben had mocked me. Cale looked at me for a long moment. He didn't get up. He didn't seem excited. He just ... watched. Then he set his cane down. He lumbered over to the glass, his massive knuckles making no sound on the soft grass. He sat down. Right in front of me, his knees almost touching the barrier. He was so close I could see the small, old scar over his left eyebrow. From a time he'd fallen from a climbing structure as a juvenile, he just sat there, looking at me with his dark, quiet, knowing eyes. Slowly, I raised my hand. Not in a signal this time. I just placed my palm flat against the cool, smooth glass. Cale watched the movement. He leaned his great head forward until his brow rested against the glass on his side. His warm breath fogged the spot. We stayed like that for a full minute. No words, no signals. Just an old woman and an old gorilla. A silent understanding. I am here. You are well. I thought about Ben. I thought about the next generation of keepers, the ones who would be here long after I was gone. They were the ones who would care for Cale in his old age. My vindication today wasn't about proving a young man wrong. It was about realizing that I still had work to do. My knowledge wasn't just my own. It belonged to the animals. And it was my job to pass it on. I finally lowered my hand. Cale lifted his head. He gave me one last, long look, then turned, picked up his sugarcane, and walked back to his straw bed. I smiled. I turned away from the glass. And for the first time in 2 years, I walked out of the zoo gates not as a guest, but as someone who knew she would be back tomorrow.